some of the most challenging things that I've recited in terms of fathoming their meaning have been written by Brooke Ziporin. I hope that's how you pronounce his name. Anyhow, in a video that I did containing non-contiguous excerpts from his work called Being and Ambiguity, Philosophical Experiments with Tiantai Buddhism, I engaged in some dialogue with one of my listeners that I'll share in this particular video, when he said, "If all roads lead to reality, doesn't this have problematic outcomes for morality? Is terrorism as expressive of truth as charity work, for example?" Well, that's a heavy question and a very important one. So here's the reply I gave my friend. I said, "A famous Zen poem says, quote, 'The great way is not difficult if you just don't pick and choose,' close quote. And within Pure Land Buddhism, there is the notion that we are, quote, 'saved by Amida Buddha, regardless of our degree of, quote, evil.' Shinran, the founder of the True Pure Land sect, addressed the potential problem of antinomianism by saying, quote, 'Do not take a liking to poison just because there is an antidote,' close quote. That said, your question is an important one, and one that leads to a kind of paradox in considering the mundane or conventional versus the transcendent or non-dual. When I think about this, I think also in terms of developmental stages, that when we try to raise a child, we don't start them off on a diet of non-dualism. What we do is we have to train them as to what is good, what is bad, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is pro-social, what is anti-social. It's important, I think, for a human being to have a grounding in this mundane or conventional sort of morality, really, in terms of how we can get along with each other within our societies. We're probably, as far as I'm aware, fairly well genetically oriented toward getting along with a small group. In the early days of our species, as I understand it, we sort of gravitated toward, groups of maybe 25, 30, 40, 50 maybe at the most. And so we had our little, I don't know what the word would be, I guess tribe in some sense. And there was, I think, some degree of mutual cooperation and harmony within those small groups. Now that may or may not be true, but that's my impression anyway. Whereas when we expanded into larger groups, with the advent of agriculture, for example, it became much easier for there to be what the sociologists talk about as far as in-groups and out-groups. In other words, some groups that were looked down upon by other groups and vice versa. So it depends on where one is coming from as to how those judgments are made. But that's kind of being off on a tangent. The point being, in the context of there not being an inherent survival basis for harmony and mutual cooperation and sort of distribution of functions in terms of what is needed in order to survive, we have to teach these things to young people. We have to teach what is good, what is wrong, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable. So it's only, I would argue, at a later stage in development that the whole question of sort of a spiritual transcendence of the dualism of good and evil becomes a relevant paradigm. And so, anyway, that's another kind of a perspective that you can take a look at in the context of this fundamental question of is terrorism as expressive of truth as charity work, for example. Anyhow, this listener went on in this dialogue and he said, "Thank you for your wise comment. It's a conundrum that I've struggled with on and off with Buddhism. Ultimately, I think it may be irreconcilable except for in a wordless understanding." And I love the way there he gets at this notion of truth being beyond words and concepts. It's inconceivable, this sense of non-dual consciousness. So again, it's kind of another level from the mundane and conventional, where we do and we must have a sense of right and wrong. Even though, again, Shinran at the end of his life said, I don't know either right or wrong. But on the other hand, what he did was a whole lot of good stuff, a whole lot of things that we would judge to be correct in terms of helping bring comfort and peace to people in the context of their spiritual needs. So anyway, again, he says, I think it may be irreconcilable except for in a wordless understanding. And he goes on to say, my practice leads me to suspect that while, quote, conventional morality may be transcended, a truer or higher sense of goodness is revalidated with realization, and that it reaffirms virtues like kindness back in the phenomenal realm. Boy, I really like that the notion that a sense of goodness is revalidated, and it reaffirms virtues like kindness back in the phenomenal realm. So I responded by saying I thought that conundrum is an apt term. I said, your understanding rings true to me. If one immerses oneself in the teaching, it is hard not to be impressed with the emphasis on compassion and on the mandate to help other beings in whatever way we can. That, after all, is the Bodhisattva's vow and mission. And there I quoted the basic 4 vows of the Bodhisattva, namely, sentient beings are numberless, I vow to save them all. Desires are inexhaustible, I vow to put an end to them. The dharmas are boundless, I vow to master them. The Buddha way is unattainable, I vow to attain it. So again, this notion that to the extent, at least within the context of the Buddhist tradition, that the self-power path is pursued, which can be characterized in Mahayana terms as the Bodhisattva path, it's not divorced at all from virtue and good behavior. In fact, it's laced with it within the context of the sutras. And the essential component is, of course, compassion and a desire to help sentient beings. So going on, he said, in response to my comment and quote of the vows, he said, it's like the notion of awakening as being the realization that first there are mountains and trees, then they are seen to be unreal, then their reality is reaffirmed. And I might mention that in the context of his name, his YouTube channel name, it includes the word Zen. So I think this individual, my friend who's having this dialogue with me, is probably oriented primarily toward the Zen tradition. So again, he says, it's like the notion of awakening as being the realization that first there are mountains and trees, then they are seen to be unreal, then their reality is reaffirmed, which of course I think is a quite famous kind of Zen notion, that upon becoming enlightened, basically the mundane again becomes the primary focus, with one's attention being sort of riveted by one's here and now experience in this very moment. He says, but we recognize, of course, that while the first and third stages, namely that first there are mountains and trees, and then the third stage when the reality is reaffirmed, but we recognize, of course, that while the first and third stages are looking at precisely the same reality, and on the surface are saying the same thing, the third stage is of a higher level of appreciation than the first. And I'm not sure how much ultimately Buddhism would speak in terms of higher or lower, but it certainly does, as one is traveling on a path toward some kind of attainment, which again ultimately really is characterized by no attainment. But the point being that quote higher level of appreciation would be, I would proffer, that intense focus on the here and now experience of suchness. He goes on to say, Tiantai seems to be pointing to this fact. And now we've gotten to Ziporn's commentary on Tiantai, which is the Tiantai in Chinese, or Tendai in the Japanese Buddhist tradition, which is that middle path that in a nutshell, in a very simplistic nutshell, I guess, talks about that neither existence nor non-existence, and that there's somehow a center that integrates these more extreme kinds of perspectives. So he says, Tiantai seems to be pointing to this fact, that the Buddhist path is a way to see clearly what is already there. The path itself seems to be pointless, but it is in fact the very thing that is needed to get back to what we've always known, but to see it as if for the first time. This gentleman, he's very eloquent, and I appreciated his commentary. And what I may do actually is go back when I'm done blabbering about with some of my own ideas and interrupting. I may go back and share some of his perspectives in a non-interrupted way. But I basically said, thanks for your insightful comments, my friend. And he said, thank you for your wonderful videos and playlists that continue to shape my understanding and love of the Buddha's teaching so profoundly. And then I closed with, I am pleased to know that my videos have been of interest to you, and I commend you for your motivation to delve into the wonderful Buddhadharma. Your love of the Buddha's teachings will, I am sure, translate into deeper and deeper understanding over the course of time. That, at least, has been my experience. So, again, just going back, because he, in effect, answers his own question when he says that this issue of morality in the context of the mundane versus the transcendent, he says, it's a conundrum I've struggled with on and off with Buddhism. Ultimately, I think it may be irreconcilable, except for in a wordless understanding. My practice leads me to suspect that while conventional morality may be transcended, a truer or higher sense of goodness is revalidated with realization, and that it reaffirms virtues like kindness back in the phenomenal realm. And he goes on to say, it's like the notion of awakening as being the realization that first there are mountains and trees, then they are seen to be unreal, and then their reality is reaffirmed. But we recognize, of course, that while the first and third stages are looking at precisely the same reality, and on the surface are saying the same thing, the third stage is of a higher level of appreciation than the first. Tiantai seems to be pointing to this fact, that the Buddhist path is a way to see clearly what is already there. The path itself seems to be pointless, but is, in fact, the very thing that is needed to get back to what we've always known, but to see it as if for the first time. Thank you, my friend, for your wisdom. Namo Mita Boots. Namo Mita Boots. Namo Mita Boots.